The early morning light filled the hospital room, gently enveloping the three women standing guard over the man in the bed. He laid silently, his once muscular body now withered in pain, eaten from the inside out by cancer. A late 40-ish petite brunette cradled the man's hand next to her cheek. Her curly, shoulder-length hair hid her stained face. Sitting beside her was a late-20s version of the woman. On the other side of the bed was a 30-ish, tall, attractive blonde, who bore many of the same facial features as the man lying in the bed. Lovingly, she carefully wiped her father's now bald head. Their silent vigil was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A tall, blond man stuck his head in. "Sis, is he awake?" he whispered to the blonde. "Not right now," Tim replied Angie. "He's only awake for short amounts of time. The morphine keeps putting him to sleep." "Molly," he said gently, turning to the older brunette. "May we come in?" She looked up at him, smiled weakly, and nodded. He stepped back and opened the door. A very attractive woman in her early 50s sheepishly entered the room. Her long hair was a heavy mixture of blonde and silver streaks that flowed loosely about her shoulders. Even at her age, she still had a body women 20 years younger envied. "Molly," she softly greeted. "Gwen, please come in." Angie stood up and looked over at Molly. Molly smiled reassuringly and nodded. The young blonde turned back to the guest. "I guess you can sit here, Mom." "Thank you, Angie." What ensued was a human chess match. Each move by one of the human chess pieces caused a move by another piece. Each advancement toward the king resulted in a defensive counter-move to protect him. Finally, the room settled. Gwen now sat on the other side of the bed from Molly and her daughter, Jessica. Angie had moved to a chair in one corner, while Tim sat in the other corner chair. "Thank you for allowing me to come today," Gwen said softly. "When the kids told me Joe was going to spend whatever time was left at home, I had to ask to see him." "It was the right thing to do," Molly replied weirdly. "I talked it over with Joe, and he agreed. He doesn't want any visitors once we get him home later today. So I'm glad you were able to make it here before he's released." He softly groaned as his eyes slowly opened. Eyes that hadn't looked into each other for over a decade now became locked. "Gwen," he croaked softly. "I'm here, Joe," she whispered. "Where's Molly?" "I'm right here, honey," his wife said gently, patting his hand. He smiled weakly, gazing into his wife's soft brown eyes. Looking around the room, he took note of everyone there. "We are gathered here today," he said, smirking as he heard several chuckles. Closing his eyes, he sighed deeply. He cleared his throat and stared at his ex-wife. "Okay, Gwen," he said weakly. "Say what you need to say. I'm sorry if I doze. I can't seem to stay awake." "I understand, Joe," Gwen said. "I'll keep it brief, but if you fall asleep, please don't worry." "Most of what I need to say is for our kids anyway." He nodded, and she took a deep breath. "Joe, I just wanted to tell you goodbye. Already said that. 10 years ago. Yes," she said with a slight tremor in her voice. "I remember, but when I heard you were dying, I knew I still had some things I needed to say to you. Forgive me," she intensely whispered. "Please, Joe, tell me you forgive me." They stared at each other silently for a minute before Joe sighed. "You're forgiven," he said softly. Gwen sat back, obviously surprised by his response. "Just like that?" she questioned. He snorted. "No, not just like that. Took years to say that and mean it." Molly was key. He winced in pain and let out a muffled groan. Reaching over, he pushed the button on his morphine drip. Within seconds, his breathing deepened and his face visibly relaxed. Just later, he was asleep. "I'm sorry, Gwen," Molly said gently. "He'll be out for a while. I know it probably wasn't what you hoped it would be." Gwen shook her head. "Actually, it was more than I dared hope for. I could only dream of him saying he forgave me." "I know. I have you to thank for that." "No," Molly said gently, shaking her head. "I could never talk Joe into doing something he truly doesn't want to do. Oh, I know he'll do things for me he prefers not to, but never something he didn't feel was right. While I'm still thankful he found someone like you after I lost his love." "You didn't lose his love, Mother," Angie spat. "You threw it away." "I know, Angie," Gwen replied sadly, "and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." You have regrets too, don't you? Angie snorted and then sat quietly, lips pursed tightly, looking as if she'd sucked on a lemon. Sweetheart, we all have regrets, things we wished we hadn't done, or things we'd hoped would have turned out differently. Some of those things we had no control over, while others we brought upon ourselves. My greatest regret is that I allowed myself to go insane during those months. Don't try to excuse, Angie snapped. No, I didn't say I wasn't responsible for my actions. Only that my thinking was severely messed up during that time. There were a lot of things happening back then. Things I doubt either you or Tim were aware of. I know neither your father nor I ever told you details of everything that happened. Joe chose not to do that because he felt I cheated him, and not you too, since you were both already out of the house. I never told you about it because it would have made you hate me even more than you already do. I don't hate you, Mother, Angie said coldly. I hate what you did, not you. However, I'll never sit quietly and listen to anyone downplay the magnitude of destruction and pain your cheating cost. Angie, Tim, please believe me when I say I never considered the amount of pain my actions would cost. How could you not, Mom? Tim said calmly from his chair. You had to know that cheating on Dad would hurt him. You and our family were the world to him. You're right, I didn't know what I was doing was wrong, but I ignored the possible consequences. When I did let myself think, I immediately knew the danger I'd put my marriage in. Unfortunately, that realization didn't come until I was already in the affair. By then, it was far too late. During the divorce, everyone asked me why I'd done such a horrible thing. I wish I would have had a better explanation other than the pathetic excuses I came up with back then. I've had 10 years to dissect my actions, and I believe I now have a better idea of what happened. This isn't an excuse, she said, staring coldly at her daughter. Just an explanation of how it happened. Up until now, I've never wanted to admit the reasons because they make me look as selfish and shallow as I was. Simply stated, several things happened at the same time that presented me the opportunity to cheat on Joe, and I arrogantly and foolishly walked right into it. Gwen, Molly said gently, you're a very beautiful woman. I'm sure you had many opportunities to break your marriage vows over all the years you two were married. Gwen smiled weakly at her ex-husband's wife. Thank you, and you're right, I had lots of opportunities, but not like this. Joe had started traveling again after he'd accepted a large contract. I knew he took it to help pay for Angie and Tim's college, and we discussed it and were in agreement. It was only for 6 months, but it affected me worse than I'd ever dreamed it would. When he traveled earlier in our marriage, I'd had the kids there to help me deal with it. With both of them in college, I was by myself. I felt so old and alone. When it worked, a handsome, younger man began pursuing me. I knew Douglas was just in it for the sex, but having a good-looking, rising corporate star giving you attention is flattering. Angie snorted as Tim's pained look of disappointment was written plainly on his face. Gwen quickly continued, like I said. She said calmly as she looked at her children, I was arrogant and selfish. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but hopefully you'll see how I allowed it to happen. I want you to know it was never anything that your father did or didn't do. It was my fears and then my ego that opened the door. I never stopped loving him even during the affair. How can you say that, Mother? Angie sneered. You were sleeping with another man. I know you don't believe it, but it's true. The problem wasn't that I didn't love your father because I did. The problem was I loved myself more. During the time I put my needs and wants ahead of the family and your father's needs. For 4 months, I used my unhappiness to justify my cheating my marriage vows. When I finally came to my senses, I broke off the affair, but the seeds of destruction had already been planted. I'd hoped I could live with it and spare your father the pain of finding out his wife was a cheating 304. I knew there was a good chance he'd divorce me if he ever found out. Then why tell him, Mom? Tim said sadly. Was it just to ease you on guilt? Angie interjected. No, sweetheart. That wasn't the only reason. Yes, my guilt was eating me alive. I knew your father could tell things were different after that contract. That you're after my affair. Things between us were so tense at times. I realized then sooner or later I was going to have to confess to him. However, fate stepped in to make it sooner than I'd hoped. When I broke off the affair with Douglas, I knew neither of us wanted anyone to know about it. He actually had more to lose than I did. He was married to the daughter of one of our board of directors and was our corporation's star project manager. He was on course to be our youngest corporate vice president. So when I ended the affair, I made one stipulation: he wasn't ever to have contact with Joe or work on any project with him. My corporation had contracted with your father's company several times in the past, and I couldn't bear the thought of Joe answering to Douglas. Douglas would always have the secret knowledge he'd slept with me, and he might have somehow held that over your father. I couldn't take the chance he'd disrespect Joe. Sounds silly, right? After I disrespected your father for those months, Douglas agreed, of course. Things seemed like they were going to be okay if I could just get past the guilt. Then that damn government contract came along. It was potentially worth millions, and I knew Douglas would head up any GSA project if we wanted. I also knew Joe's company was going to be deeply involved with it as well. It was after we won the bid my fears were realized. It was announced Joe would be heading up the engineering team that was an essential element to the project. He, of course, would be answering to the project manager, Douglas. I confronted Douglas and reminded him about our agreement, but he told me business was business and refused to step aside. I don't think he believed I'd go through with my threat. He was wrong, when paused and took a deep breath. The tears streaming down her face attested to the pain the memories cost. Your father handled my confession like I expected he would. He sat stoically and listened, asking several clarifying questions. I could see him gathering the information he needed before making a decision. When I saw a tear begin to run down his cheek, I knew it would end badly for us. The next day, he removed himself from the team. I don't know if he was trying to take the high road and protect his company's interest, or if he suspected what would happen when he stepped down. Either way, it couldn't have worked out any better for your father, since all hell broke loose. He was a key part to that team, so when he tried to step down, it got everyone's attention, including the big wigs in both our companies. When they started asking questions, their assistants started digging for answers. It didn't take them long to uncover Douglas in my affair. That's when the nightmares that had tormented me for the past year became a reality. As I expected, the dollar sign outweighed any clout Douglas had, and he was removed from the project. It worked out well for Joe and his company, though. The embarrassment of the situation prompted my corporate leadership to offer a larger percentage of the contract's profits to his company, and he ended up getting promoted. Douglas and I didn't fare near as well. Why would you have expected to? I didn't comment it coldly. I didn't sweetheart go and said softly, not even back then. The shame of her confession was etched in her usually pretty face. It was obvious she'd carried this burden for many years. What I could never imagine was how bad things were about to get. Douglas and I both tried to find other employment only to find we were effectively blacklisted. Apparently Douglas' father-in-law took his family and daughter's embarrassment very personal. Douglas ended up getting assigned to every nasty project in some of the worst third-world countries. After spending several years jumping from one armpit of the world to the next, he finally gave up. He gave his wife her divorce and crawled away with nothing. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Detroit. Since he was a couple levels above me on the corporate ladder, he was still considered one of my supervisors. I know the company feared a lawsuit, so they promoted me. They promoted me right back into some office that never sees the light of day. I guess I shouldn't complain. The money is decent, but my career is essentially over. She paused and looked into the eyes of each individual in the room, as if she was trying to assess how they were receiving her confession. Jessica had a pinched look on her face, as she was obviously annoyed to hear how her stepfather had been cheated. Molly looked concerned and guarded. It was easy to tell she already knew most of this. It was Tim and Angie's looks that caused her to falter. The hurt and disappointment in their eyes seemed like it was more than she could bear. Slowly she gathered herself and continued, "If I thought things were bad at work, Then what was happening at home was a living hell. My marriage was collapsing, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it. Joe sat down and talked to me a few times after he filed for divorce. I apologized until I was blue in the face. I told him that none of it was his fault, that it was me who destroyed our wonderful marriage. He said it couldn't have been too wonderful if it wasn't enough to keep me out of Douglas' bed. That hurt. I understood why he was bitter and why he'd said it, but it still hurt. Joe then asked me why I cheated. My answer was just a string of excuses. After that, he broke off all communication with me. At first, I was angry and frustrated. I was mad at myself for bringing all this down on us, and I was frustrated at Joe for not trying to help save the marriage. "Oh, please, Mother," Angie scolded. "If Daddy would have cheated on you, would you have forgiven him and fought for the marriage?" One slowly shook her head and smiled sadly. "We both know the answer to that, sweetheart. I would have been much more vindictive and would have tried to inflict much more pain than your father did." "Angie," I said, I was disappointed. Not that I didn't understand why he was reacting that way. I didn't really blame him. I was angry because I saw our 20-year marriage circling the drain. I knew I had pulled the plug, but I was infuriated that I couldn't stop it. Only Joe had the ability to save it, and he chose not to. You know, if he'd really wanted to make my life a living hell, he would have taken me back. There's several small gaps. You've always had a way with words, haven't you? Mother, Angie sneered. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Angie, she said with tears beginning to fill her eyes. What did you mean, Mom? Tim asked gently from behind her. I would have done anything to show your father how sorry I was for destroying us. I would have degraded myself in ways that would have shamed an old Tijuana 304 if he could have somehow found a way to love me again. But I knew the night I told him about my affair that it would never happen. Even through my tears, I could see how deeply I'd wounded the man I claimed to love. I swear I saw his love for me die right there in front of me. Our marriage was over right then. I saw it in his eyes. He had to move on, Mom, Tim said softly. We all did. Yes, I know. I also know I'm still having some difficulties doing that. You kids have been a great help to me in those areas. Oh, I know you were angry with me at first. No, furious was more like it. You had every right to be, but you didn't abandon me. I'm not sure I could have survived that. I'm thankful Joe didn't turn you against me. Dad would have never done that, Tim stated calmly. No, Gwen said, shaking her head. No, that wouldn't have been him. She smiled sadly at her son and then turned towards Molly. Did you know I prayed that somehow, some way I could get my marriage back? I begged him, pleaded with God to somehow change Joe's heart and mind and give me another chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but it's what I wanted. I held on to that dream for over a year. Then Angie told me he'd started seriously dating you, Molly. That was when I knew my prayers weren't going to be answered. It wasn't until after you and Joe got married that I seriously tried to get on with my life. I started dating again, and that was when I found out just what kind of a marriage I'd had before I destroyed it. We'd had something very good, but I'd forgotten how special it was. But I was reminded when I started dating again. Boy, how I was reminded. I dated quite a bit, but it never failed. I'd start comparing them to Joe, and it wouldn't last too long after that. There's a special kind of intimacy between lovers that only comes with time. Only someone who's made love to you many times before knows when you want to be taken forcefully with a raw passion, or when just gentle caresses and a soft kiss will send you over the edge. You can't imagine how humbling it is to realize just because you crave your lover to know those things that won't happen. It's not because he's not willing, but because he doesn't know you and your body well enough to know what brings you the most satisfaction at that moment. My nightmare was realizing I was the reason those things were gone. Because of my actions, every romantic relationship I now had was forced to start from scratch. Oh, there were a few relationships that seemed to be promising over the years. 2 of them even ended in proposals, but I turned both of them down. Why? Molly asked with concern written on her face. Report. Why didn't I accept? Gwen sighed deeply. Well, that's a bit complicated. One reason was I was still in love with my ex-husband. Mother, Angie scolded again. No, Gwen snapped back at her. You don't get to tell me what I'm already very much aware of. You can't say anything I haven't heard or told myself a million times. None of you get to tell me what I feel. I love your father and I always will. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'll always feel guilty for what I did. I'm learning to try to live with those feelings and move on. In some ways I have, but in other areas I'm still stuck. Angie, sweetheart, Molly said softly, trying to calm the situation. It's okay. I'm not jealous. I know how much your daddy loves me. Gwen flinched slightly. I know that as well, Molly, Gwen continued, steadying herself. That's why I felt like I could make that statement. I know you will forever have his love. I admit I'm jealous of that, but it was my own doing. Please, I don't want anyone to think my feelings for Joe were the reason I turned down those marriage proposals. It's much deeper than that. Just like everyone in here, I questioned that if I really loved my husband like I said I did, how could I cheat him like that? I wish I had an answer I could live with. So I compared my love for my would-be suitors to my love for Joe. And since my feelings for each of them wasn't as strong as my feelings for him, I had a problem. If I couldn't stay faithful to Joe, how could I promise either of them my fidelity? I cared enough about them to turn each one down. At that time, it was the right thing to do, since it wouldn't have been fair to them. I'm sorry, Molly gently spoke. I'm sorry you're going through that. Gwen smiled sadly. It's easy to see why Joe fell in love with you, Molly, she said sadly. You're beautiful on both the inside and outside. Thank you, but please, Molly said, her face pinched with concern. Please don't make me out to be some kind of saint. I have my own regrets, Gwen. Most concern my first marriage, but one in particular is related to Joe. Mom, an alarmed Jessica questioned. No, it wasn't something terrible, but it is something I'm ashamed of. Since Gwen has been so brave when talking about her regrets, I'll try to follow suit. It happened a few months after Joe and I had started dating. Our dates have been quite hot and heavy, but we hadn't them. Well, we weren't. Molly paused, her face contorted as she struggled to find the appropriate words. Having sex, Jessica said, smiling. You mean bumping uglies? Angie added, snickering, hiding the sausage, doing king, girls. Molly gasped, knocking boots. Jessica held, hitting it, making babies, girls. Molly barked, her face bright red. Tim laughed along with the girls as Gwen quietly tried to hide her pain expression. What I was going to say, Molly said, trying to regain her composure, was that Joe and I hadn't yet been intimate. I knew it had been a while for him, while both of us, and the sexual tension between us was complicating everything. Then I overheard a phone call. It was obvious Molly was starting to get uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, she continued, I heard Joe talking to someone. At first, I thought it was you, Angie, but now I realize I don't know who it was. But whoever it was, Joe was talking about possibly reconciling with Gwen. I knew I loved Joe, but I was still so scared after the disaster of my first marriage. Even though my first husband had abandoned us 9 years earlier, I had never let a man as close as I had Joe. I knew he was a good man, and he would be a good father and a great husband, so I decided that he was mine. That week, I shamelessly threw myself at him in an attempt to claim him and keep him solely focused on me. In short, I seduced him. Mom, Jessica said, smiling, I seriously doubt it took much seduction to get Dad's attention. I mean, damn, every time I saw you two, you were always touching each other. Seriously, Molly, Angie added. Daddy could never seem to keep his hands off of you. Your father has always been very affectionate. Molly replied. Jessica snorted while Angie and Tim smiled. Is affectionate another word for horny? Jessica grinned. Jess, Molly scolded. The 3 adult kids laughed. Gwen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mom, Jessica said, still smiling. I can't see why you'd regret showing the man you love how much you desired him. Sweetheart, I don't regret that. What I regret was it took the fear of losing him to bring me to that point. I also wonder what would have happened if I hadn't done that. Would Joe have waited on me? Would he have gone back to Gwen? Whatever would have happened, I would have hoped he was happy. I know I've been more than satisfied with the life we've shared. Molly, Tim said gently. Dad always says you, and just saved him. Molly nodded and softly laughed. I know he does, she said warmly, but the truth is he saved us as well. After my ex took off, I had some real trust issues. I dated off and on again for almost 10 years, but those issues were always in the way. I had trouble believing any man would want me for something other than just sex. Then Joe shattered those misconceptions. Well, just chuckled as she looked at her grinning stepsister. What? Molly asked, her confusion clearly written on her face. Sure, Dad wanted you for more than just sex, of course he did. Honey, oh my, Tim, Angie and just laughed as they watched Molly's face turn bright red again. Jessica Patterson, you behave, she replied, fighting back a shy smile. Your father's love has been so much more than just that. He's a good man and a great father. Even when he first got sick, he was still looking out for us. I couldn't have prayed for a better, more loving husband. He's made these last 8 years happier than I'd ever thought possible. I never realized Joe ever seriously considered reconciling with me when stated softly. I wonder who he would have been talking to about something so personal. Well, since this is apparently Jerry Springer Family Confession Day, Angie stated sarcastically, that was probably me. Daddy and I had several conversations concerning that. I didn't realize you were so involved with his decisions back then. Molly said gently. Angie sighed, looked over it just then back to Molly. More than you can probably guess as well, Angie said calmly. I knew Daddy was at a crossroads back then, whether to live in the past or to move forward. He told he was falling in love with you, Molly, and if he didn't break it off, then he'd probably ask you to marry him. He said he still had feelings for Mom, though. He told me you can't be married to someone for that long and not still have some feelings for them. I asked him about those feelings. He told me where once they had been almost purely loved, now they were a mixture of love and hate, anger and bitterness, weariness and despair. He was struggling on whether to go back and try to work out those feelings or to start fresh. Naturally, since I've been trying to set him up with Molly, I pushed him that way. You tried to set him up with other women, Gwen said sadly. I didn't realize you hated me that much. Mom, like I said, I don't hate you, but this wasn't about you. This was about Daddy. I saw what you're afraid of to him. It almost killed him. On the outside, he might have appeared strong and calm, but on the inside, he was bleeding to death. I stayed with him that summer after you told him about your affair. It was a month after your confession, and all hell was breaking loose. I can't tell you the number of nights I'd go up to his room to check on him and hear him crying. He wouldn't cry in front of me, but when he was alone in his room, he'd let the pain out. I'd let quietly outside his door in the hallway and cry with him. Tears filled Gwen's eyes as she slowly shook her head. I never knew, she said quietly. I knew I'd hurt him, but I never saw any signs of his pain other than his occasional angry outbursts. That's because he never wanted you to see it. He didn't want you to have the satisfaction of knowing how badly you'd wounded him. I never meant to hurt him like that. I was selfish and totally focused on what I wanted and needed, but I didn't maliciously try to hurt your father. Whether you did it intentionally or just through your stupidity isn't really important. Mom, the fact was you did it. So when he was faced with the choice of going back to a wife who cheated on him and poisoned years of good memories, or starting again with a woman who loved him and would never cheat on him, I pushed for the latter. We all know it would have taken months or years of working, though the trust issues, just to get to a level he could begin to relax and be happy again with you, Mom. So hell yes, I pushed for him to start fresh with Molly. I do regret manipulating him a little, and I even sort of feel bad that I had a hand in making sure you two didn't get back together. But to be honest, Mother, this wasn't about you anymore. This was about my father's happiness, and I believed and still believed he was happier with Molly than going back and trying to wade through all the bullshit of rebuilding his marriage with you. Angie, I didn't realize you had played matchmaker so well, Molly interjected gently. I'm torn slightly between scolding you and hugging you and thanking you. Well, Jessica interjected. She didn't do it quite alone. I've got my own confession to add to all this. Jess, Molly asked in surprise. Mom, you know I met Angie in college. She was an upperclassman who was tutoring me my first year. We became friends, and it didn't hurt that she had a cute younger brother, a couple years older than me. She looked at Tim and sadly smiled before turning back to her mother. I was still living at home, and Angie came over several times. I could tell she was watching you very closely. When I confronted her about it, she shared her thoughts that you and her father would be perfect together. I was going to move on to campus the next year, and was worried about you being left alone. I guess that was when we conspired to find a way to get you two together to see if there was any chemistry. I'd gone out with Tim a couple of times before Angie invited me to stay the weekend at their house. When I first met Dad, Joe, I fell in love with him immediately. Angie snorted a laugh. She fell for him almost as quickly as you did. Molly, Angie snickered. Bullshit. Jessica snapped, smiling. I fell for him at least a full week faster than my mother did. It took her that long to pull her head out of her, but, and accept the fact she loved him too. Jess, language, Molly stated firmly before allowing a small grin to escape. Jessica playfully stuck her tongue out at her mother and smiled innocently. Anyway, since I was hooked, we began planning on how to get you two together. Angie came up with the idea of inviting both of you and I for a weekend visit. I'm sorry to say the story we used to cover our plan was that I was really into Tim and wanted my mom to meet him. Jessica turned to Tim. I'm sorry, Tim. I guess I never really apologized to you for giving you the impression I was more serious about us than I really was. You were a great guy when we were dating, and I was obviously very attracted to you, but you weren't in love with me. I know, Tim interjected. I couldn't figure out what was going on at first. I knew I cared more for you than you did for me, but that first visit to my home was a surprise. Then, after seeing you with my dad, I was even more confused. I won't tell you that a guy's ego doesn't take a hit when his girlfriend falls more for his father than she does for him, but after your next visit with your mom, I finally understood. Up till then, I was afraid I'd fallen for a girl with some serious daddy issues. Well, Jessica laughed. I guess in a way I did. I don't know too many 19-year-olds who changed their last name when their mother remarries. Even though we never lived under the same roof, he's been more of a father than any other man ever has. Well, Tim grinned after seeing your mom and watching Dad's reaction to her and you. It was very obvious. I'd forgotten how long it had been since I'd seen him smile and laugh like that. The silent room was filled with both reminiscent smiles and troublesome regrets. Well, Tim said quietly, since everyone else has confessed to some deep dark secret, I guess it's my turn. With all eyes turned to him, Tim cleared his throat. I just wanted to let you all know that you'll probably read something in the papers next week that might upset you. And yes, it's true. I'm a lost Kardashian sister, and I've recently become engaged to Bruce. Excuse me, Caitlyn Marie Jenner. Hey ho, Angie snorted. The room filled with sporadic laughter, a stark contrast to the earlier mood. Just like his father, both Gwyn and Molly said simultaneously. The two women stared at each other in surprise before Tim interjected again. Thank you, he said, smiling warmly. I can't think of a better compliment. The room slowly drained of the small chuckles and settled into an uneasy quietness before Gwyn gracefully stood up. Molly, she said with a small, sad smile, thank you again for allowing me to come here today. I'm still trying to move on. This meeting was a big step for me. Thank you for letting it happen. You're very welcome, Gwyn, and I hope you're able to go on and have a wonderful life. This was mainly Joe's decision, even though we both felt some good could come from this. If he hadn't, I wouldn't have agreed to it. I won't let anyone hurt my husband. I wish, Gwyn whispered, I wish I'd been that passionately loyal. She looked over at her son. Tim, would you drive me to my hotel? He nodded and gathered his things. Gwyn looked back at the fragile man sleeping in the bed. Molly, please tell Joe he's in my prayers. So are you and Jessica. I will, and thank you. Tim turned and slowly walked out of the room. Once safely on the other side of the door, the tears began to stream down her face, and she quietly sobbed. She realized that was the last time she'd see the love of her life alive. 2.5 weeks later, Joseph Randall Patterson, age 53, passed away. He died in his sleep while he was at home, surrounded by his loving family. The graveside service had been bittersweet. Molly had sat between Jessica and Angie in the front row. Much to the surprise of some in attendance, Gwyn also sat in the front row between Angie and Tim. After the service, friends and family had given their condolences and then left, heading for the family reception. Now all three adult children surrounded Molly as they stood by the limos. "Molly," Angie said in a gentle voice, "I want to thank you again. I never thought I'd see Daddy smile again after the divorce, but you and Jess brought that back into his life. You reminded him he could love again, and there was no doubt he loved you both." Molly reached over and gently took her hand. "Never forget how much he loved you and Tim. He was always so proud of you two." "We know," Tim said, smiling sadly, "but divorces make it hard on everyone. Even though Angie and I had already left home, their divorce was hard on us. We wanted to be there for Dad because he was so hurt and angry, but we weren't able to be there every day. We're so grateful he found you. Angie and I also want to thank you for how you treated Mom these last few weeks. Mom allowed her to say goodbye to Dad and be a part of celebrating his life today. Not a lot of people would have allowed an ex-spouse to do that. Oh, honey, your dad and I knew it was important to Angie and you, as well as your mother." "It means more than you know," Angie added softly. "When Daddy fell in love with you, he was able to move on with his life, but Mom never really has. Hopefully, you and Daddy allowing her to say goodbye will help." "Molly, not only did you give my daddy a new life, you might have allowed my mom to do the same. I love you, Mother, and I love you both so." Molly started to say before her voice cracked, "I love you both." Molly tried to stifle a sob as she reached out to lean against the limo. The tears began to stream down her face. "I'm going to miss him so much," she sobbed. Tim stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her as she buried her face into his chest and wept. The two younger women held each other as they watched her grieve the loss of her love. Slowly, she regained her composure, and the group solemnly turned their attention to a solitary woman who was kneeling beside the grave site. Oblivious to her audience, the woman there quietly sobbed. She gently stroked the cold marble headstone as she whispered the things of her heart to the man she once called husband. Angie and Tim silently walked over and stood on either side of their mother. "Mama," Angie whispered gently, "it's time to go.